Hello? Hello?
Hi, this is Shannon.
Hi, Shannon. It's Susan.
Hi, Susan. We are live. We will start in about another minute. Just make sure you have YouTube muted if you're going to talk and your phone muted. I guess that doesn't matter, but YouTube has to be muted if you're going to talk. And then, of course, they won't be able to see you. They can just hear you.
Okay, but I'm on my phone,
One,
so
one,
it
one
should be
second,
okay.
Susan. Okay, Susan, you are on YouTube, just so you know. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm okay. Um, only if I want to speak, I'll be heard.
That is correct. So you would just have to make sure your phone is muted until you're ready to talk.
I'm not exactly sure how to do that. Just shut my phone down.
No. You should have
No,
like a mute on your button, like a mute button.
it sounds like you're in a quiet place though,
I
Susan.
am.
Okay. We should be good.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. We will officially call the meeting to order at this time. We're going to start with discussions. We'll start with the monthly financial and investment report.
Thank you. So you have before you the April financial statements. They were provided to you at the board meeting, so you've had a chance to look at those. But I like to bring them to the Finance Committee, since that's kind of the Finance Committee's responsibility to take a look at these. So just a few observations. In looking at the combined balance sheet, we continue to see that cash and investments has increased, and we've talked about that in the last several months. And then also just wanting to look at your fund equity unreserved number, and that'll come up when we speak on our budget as well. But as of today, again, April 30th, we've got about $35 million in the fund equity unreserved account. This is notwithstanding our current year activity. And that is a little bit over what we should have. If we are looking at the 2 months cash flow reserve plus the additional 1 month, that's about 25%, and we're at 35 million, and 25% would have been 23.5 million. In looking at the statement of activities, or the statement of revenue and expenditures, just to put it in perspective, so we are 7 months into our fiscal year, but just to remind you that on the program side expense, you're looking at 6 months worth of reimbursements, because they're like a month behind when they submit their reimbursements. So in looking at the actual expenditures year to date, that's on the left side, your column that's kind of highlighted in light orange, if you would. On the expenditure side, we have spent 28 million, and then when I compare that with budget, and when we do our budget, I think I've explained in prior meetings, I'm not taking a 1/12 anymore budget. We're trying to take an average to give us a little more closely in line, so we're looking at apples to apples. So we are at 28 million, and our budget is 23, so we have spent a little bit more in the 6 months of 4.3 million. Comparing that number to a year ago, on the far right, we had spent a year ago 25 million, so we're up from the prior year as well. And then dropping down to the bottom of the spreadsheet, the second to the last line, total expenditures, that would include all of our expenditures in addition to the program. Again, we are a little over budget, which I think is a good thing, because we're trying to get that money spent, about 3.8 million. And in comparison with prior year, we're about 2.5 million above prior year as well. The next page is just showing a bar chart of the budget to actual. Some people see numbers better in a chart than they do flat up, but there's nothing out of line here to discuss at this time. The next page of this report is the contracts that we signed and their budget transfers. Any questions on those, I'd be happy to answer. And then the last page of our financial report, we are required to present the investment activity. And we're showing that we had 91 million under investments, broken down between the different local option investment accounts as well as our bank accounts. Just reminding you that at the last board meeting, we did approve a third investment pool that we are in the process of getting the paperwork, the resolution was signed and so forth. So that will give us a third pool by the name of FLCLASS, FL Class. And so as of this report, April 30, we've got 57.2 million in the local option investment accounts, which at this time is 62.9% of our total assets under investment. And to remind you that our policy is 75%, but we're spending down through the year. Like I said, we're 6 months into the year. If you were to look at this number in November, December, when we've gotten all of our revenues from ad valorem, we're very much well over that 75% mark if we were to try to put everything in those investment pools. So having said that, I'd be happy to answer any questions on the April financials.
Do we have any questions from the board?
Finance.
Fine, I'm sorry, this is finance, this is not board. Finance committee? Hearing none, we'll move on.
All right, so now we have the proposed budget, millage rate, and the revised forecast. So most of you were in attendance at the meeting last week, so we did have a pretty hefty discussion. So these numbers have changed a little bit from the numbers that we addressed last week. A lot of it had to do with listening to your concerns and your questions. In one area that had to do with lapse, so the lapse percentages that we were using in our forecasts. And just to remind you what lapse means, we throw that word out a lot, but whatever we've budgeted either internally for our administrative budget, what we don't spend, that's considered lapse. Likewise, the money that we allocate for our contracts for all our agencies, same concept. They're allocated.
Ms. Ralston, we need you to mute yourself. We can hear you.
So same concept with the contract. So for an example, if you're allocated $1 million contract as an agency and the end of the year comes through and you have spent or request for reimbursement $800,000, you would have $200,000, which could be considered lapse. All of our lapse money, whether it's our internal budget or whether it's the contracts, it all rolls into our fund balance, and our fund balance continues to accumulate over several years going forward, and then we use that amount as a part of our next year's operating budget. Some governments don't handle it that way, but what we do is we take all the funds that are in our unreserved fund balance from the prior year, we carry it forward, and we add to that number the estimated ad valorem revenues that we anticipate getting from the county. We combine those two amounts, and now we have a number that would be total available resources, if you would, and then we calculate our expenditure budget accordingly, and then we calculate what we think we would end up at the end of the year. If we determine that we're going to spend more than our current allocation amount from, allocation is not the right word, our current dollars from the county, then that would be shown as a loss. And then the way it works is we add back the projected lapse to come up with a true loss or true profit, if that's the right word. I don't like to use profit in a government sector. But the goal or the plan is, if we are going to spend down our reserves, you would expect to see that as a negative number. Because if you started with 50 million from the prior year, you're going to get another 50 million from the county, you now have 100 to spend, and you're going to spend 110, you've got a loss of 10. Add back your lapse, say your lapse is 8 million that year, so you've got a -2, which means you're spending money from your accumulated reserves. And that's kind of the conversations we're having. That's kind of we're trying to go. So I didn't mean to go off on a big sidetrack on that, but anyway, so on our revised budget numbers, so we have right now revenues and fund balance. So when I talk about both of those pieces, we have a $21.1 million increase in those two areas. $10.6 million coming from property taxes based on the numbers and the projections that we've gotten so far. Another $10.5 million we're estimating from fund balance coming forward from the prior year. You've got a couple scenarios in front of you, which I'll kind of walk through the rest of this memo. You have two scenarios that I had put together and included in your packet. The first one is called the flat millage on the top, and the other one is considered a rolled back. So after the meeting we had last week, there was discussion and a request to calculate what a rolled back amount would look like in our budget. And just to kind of remind you what that means, that term, so you take, there is a calculation that the county goes through to determine the rollback rate. And in essence, what it tries to do is it tries to determine what millage rate would we need to use to give you the same amount of revenues, ad valorem revenues that you had from the prior year. And it calculates it. It's not spot on because there's some discounts and so forth. And when we did the rollback rate, that rate would be 0.8083. So if we plugged that number in, the forecast, and again, I'm looking at the rollback rate, we saw that it reduced revenues, which of course we anticipated, but going forward, based on the robust expenditures that we have anticipated and are trying to project for the letters of intent, for the workforce stabilization, for future programming, we could not sustain that reduced rollback rate for just 1 year. So we would have had to bump it back up to 0.8981, and then projecting, forecasting going forward, we anticipated that we would have to start either cutting back programs or reviewing programs to the tune of approximately $2 million and then going out 500 the previous years. I did mention earlier at the beginning that we revisited the lapse percentage that we were calculating. Our lapse percentage was fairly high that we were projecting. We were using a rolling average of 16.47. We did take a hard look at that, and we went back to determine, and I prepared another schedule that I gave you, which was some lapse history that we've had within JWB, and you can kind of see that we were peaking in fiscal 21 and 22, and of course we've had numerous discussions on that relative why the lapse, COVID, some of the agencies were using other government funding that they got, a variety of reasons. But our projection is showing 16.47 for fiscal 23, and then moving forward, we have gradually dropped that 13, 12, 11, and 10. So that's on the rollback. And our target, as you know, for our unreserved fund balance is to have a reserve of 8.3%. That would be 1/12. And on that projection, if you look at the rollback, that would get us at 9%, which would be very much in line with what our target is. The flat millage rate scenario, which is the other one in your packet, that's assuming that we kept the rate that we've always had, 0.8981. Everything else remained the same relative to expenditures and so forth. That projecting out would give us a targeted unreserved fund balance of 10%. Some of these things we have no control over relative to the ad valorem, or rather the property tax numbers, inflation. We can have some influence on some of those as far as what kind of COLAs we give out to our agencies, what kind of new programs we bring on board. So there's a combination of this crystal ball that we always look into to try to determine, you know, what's the best numbers, so to speak. Questions? Is that?
Do we have any questions from the committee at this time? Or comments, statements?
I just want to say thank you. You guys have done a lot of great work in a short period of time. I'm sorry if I threw a curveball at you for not being at the one meeting and then all of a sudden showing up with an opinion. But I really appreciate the very thoughtful and clear information, and also you taking the time to share that with us individually. And you just answered some questions for me before the meeting started that were helpful. So, I mean, I would not want to do a rollback rate that would require us to immediately go back, so I think it would be much better to go in between and do the 0.855, which would get us at least 2 years where we know we can stay at that rate, and then we can reassess, because as you said, we do have a lot of new programs coming on board, so we'll have time to see what those laps look like, and if we want to put more in there or focus on different ones. So we're going to have a lot more information in 2024 when we're making the 2025 budget and all that to figure out, what we need to do, if we need to go back to 0.89 or what else we need to do. So I'm very comfortable with the 0.855. I don't know if we know, it's probably hard to calculate because of the different nature of properties and how they're assessed, but I would like to know if we can have like a guesstimate of what we think the savings per individual taxpayer is from a homeowner perspective, and then maybe from a commercial property perspective. I wouldn't expect it to be a whole lot, but at the same
Right.
time, with what's going on right now, like we talked about the last time, anything is something. So I like the 0.855, and I appreciate all the work.
I do want to just point out that he's referring to a 0.8855, which is not in the board packet. So that was something that was created after conversations that I had earlier this week with some of you requesting perhaps a different rate, maybe not the rollback and maybe not the straight up, I guess, or whatever. So I did run those numbers. I do have those.
Yeah, that would be good if you could share the 855 with everyone, because I think it's
She can pull it
important
up
to see it.
on the screen. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because that's what I was waiting, and after I heard Brian say 855, then I was happy to hear, because I wasn't seeing it where it was, and I know we had this
Right.
conversation.
So here, I've pulled it up on the screen, and you have a hard copy in front of you as well. So I've called this one on the top, it's called reduced millage rate. So it's reduced from our standard rate of 8,981, but yet it's higher than the rolled back rate. I tried to plug and play around with that number to where we could maintain our unrestricted fund balance reserve. And if I were to go with that rate, I could sustain it for 2 years, and then I would have to go back up, and I just went back up to the standard rate. Again, it is showing in your future programming line that we would anticipate maybe some cuts. We'd have to start looking at that again, but it would give us in fiscal '27 a 9% unrestricted, when again, our target is 8.3. So that's kind of where I came up with that. And then Diana, isn't there that number we will hear from the county? Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, there's a max millage rate that the board can set that's only requires the majority vote instead of the 2/3 vote. So once we get the certified property taxable values on July 1, then we'll be able to calculate what that maximum millage rate would be. Last year, or this current year, FY '22, it just so happened to be 0.8550, so it might be something close this next year.
Does the significant, go ahead, Susan.
This is Susan. Yeah, I had the opportunity to speak with Beth and Laura about the middle ground and very much support a millage rate rollback that allows us to go out for 2 years without an adjustment or a significant adjustment. I think this is a middle ground consensus that works for Juvenile Welfare Board, that works for us as a board, letting public know we are realizing, the struggles out there, but not negatively impacting the ability to implement our strategic plan and to proceed with entering new programs, relationships. So I applaud, just as Brian did, the work that's been done since our last board meeting is Herculean to get all of these numbers put in front of us today. So thank you.
Yeah, I reiterate that as well. I mean, I thank you for doing that, but I also want, the 2 years is extremely important that we didn't make any adjustment. So again, thanks for doing that, because trying to do 1 year and then hit them back again would be a disservice to the community. But what I just want to make sure that the committee understands that there is an opportunity or potential to even bring the reserves down a little more based on what could be coming out of the proposals that we have, which were brought to our attention for 0 to 3 and other proposals that we have. If I remember correctly, we had put aside about $3.5 million for that. We're getting proposals as much as up to $7.5 million. They're still in the preliminary stages, so who knows where that will roll out. But I wouldn't be surprised to hear the staff to come back to us again and say, hey, these programs are really valuable and we'd like to increase that 3.5 to something else. We do have enough reserve in to be able to handle that, but I think we just need to be aware that that could happen and be prepared to look at each one of those based on the merit that they could bring. But again, we asked you to do something, Laura, and we asked your team to do something. Actually, I tried to give you a little more time to do something, and unfortunately or fortunately, there wasn't enough, and you did a fantastic job, and I want to say thank you for that.
I too want to say thank you to Laura and her team. For me, it made a big difference because I'm a visual creature. So I was conceptualizing what Mr. Onks was saying without looking at the figures, because I only had one set of figures, but I will tell you, I was in awe when you came with the middle ground. And so again, just like Mr. Onks, I am very comfortable with the middle ground, and I agree. Don't roll back for 1 year just to hit somebody again the next year. And so thank you for all your hard work.
I think you've all learned that working at JWB is not a 9-to-5 job. Virtually all of what you saw happened after hours between one set of information and another. One thing I wanted to make sure, and Colleen, you'll keep me straight on this. It's wonderful to have gotten it's wonderful to have gotten the very meaningful input from everyone at the board table, so we could hear that, we could incorporate that, we could look more deeply, and I too, applaud Laura and Diana Caro and Stacy Gill, who are all here, who very quickly put things together that would be credible, realistic, and yet figure out how we could best meet what we were hearing from the board, or many members of the board saying, we would really like to reduce it, but we want to do all these programs. We don't want to step back from the program. So I think we heard that real clearly. But the other thing that is just the world we live in is it may well, we don't know, we won't know till July 1st-ish, sometimes they don't come out exactly the day they say they will, what that rollback rate is in our situation, and therefore what majority we will need at our second trim hearing. And if you're not here, it's essentially a no vote. In other words, we need 8 yes votes if the rate that we propose is in fact higher than the rollback rate. The 855 may be a guess, but it's just not the kind of thing you can project until you get the information. So that will, that can inform what the July board does. And that, of course, is what will go into trim notices. The other thing, just so you're aware of what I'm aware of, if we choose a rate, if you choose a rate at the July board meeting that goes into the trim notices, and then at the trim hearings, you choose to reduce that millage rate because we know more or whatever, that's fine. On the other hand, if you were to choose to increase it from what you put in, what is approved at the July board and goes to the trim notices, we have the obligation as JWB to send out essentially new trim notices, first class mail, and the approximate cost is $165,000. It just kind of hurts to spend that kind of money. If we could end, You know, it just doesn't feel like a value-added activity. So I just want you to be aware of, you know, what the votes are. It's great to hear a consensus that you all have really put together and we were able to support. But it's just critical that we have people in the room on September 21st.
And I just want, go ahead.
Jim Milliken. I just wanted to make a comment. I don't have a lot of the call, but thank you. I've heard most of the call. I definitely concur with everybody. I think we just, on Beth's note, one thing I've learned is that, you know, what we set the millage rate at for the trim notice, it could not change, but we have that option to change it at the meetings. The deal is you can't, you know, to raise, like you said, it's a big cost. Better to set that lower rate at the actual hearings to potentially save us money, not knowing what that's going to be. But the other part I want to make sure the committee keeps in mind is the Fed's just raised the interest rate. Excuse my voice, I'm losing my voice. The Fed's just raised the interest rate, and we are going to in some type of recession next year. They're pretty positive it's going to happen in 23. So those things we want to take into consideration as we're moving forward. And we talk about we're okay with raising the rate back up in 2 years when everybody's hurting for money because we're in a recession. We might want to just think about that moving forward anyway. Just wanted to throw that out there, but thank you, Laura, and your staff and everybody for getting this together and putting all this extra time into it. And I know you did it after hours. So I'm very appreciative of all your time and hard work in this.
I just wanted to pipe in when we were referring to the July 21st meeting. Hopefully you all got the notice that the meeting was canceled for the 14th, and we are now have it on the 21st. The reason it was canceled is because we learned that there would be 4 board members who couldn't make the 14th meeting, and that's not even quorum. So for the 21st meeting, that's where we actually will be voting, or you all will be voting on the millage rate and the proposed budget. Right now, I have 8 people attending that meeting and 2 that will not be there. So we should be able to move forward with that. As far as the 2 trim hearings, I have one board member who has notified me that they will not be at the first trim hearing, and I have another board member who will not be at the second trim hearing. So we will have 9 attending the meetings, and we would need 8. Is that correct, Colleen?
We need 8 if you wanted to keep the millage where it is.
Or anything over the rollback rate, correct?
No, over anything, right.
Yeah.
It's 8, the statute has, you know, majority, 2/3, and then 3/4. So at the current number, the 8, 9, Diana does the math for me, I just pretend to be smart here. So at the current rate, my understanding is we would need 2/3 vote, which is 8. Hypothetically, the 0.855, we are assuming, based on educated guesses, that would only require a 6 affirmative vote. It could be a little bit higher, it could be a little bit lower, but Diana and the mathematicians will be able to calculate that number after July 1st, so it will be in the board packet on July 21st.
Yeah, I was just bringing up that we already know right now, I've got 1 that'll be absent for the 1 and 1 will be absent for the second. So just wanting to make sure that, what I really was hoping we'd get out of today's meeting is that we would have a general consensus of the Finance Committee going towards the board meeting on where we stand on millage, so that we don't have votes at the board meeting that are 5 this way, 3, 4, and 4, or whatever. But today's the day to talk about any of those other issues. I have one other chart that I put on your table when you arrived. It was not in the packet. Having gone through the board minutes, so we quickly had to do the board minutes from the meeting last Thursday. They're very rough draft, but I did read through those this morning, and one of the items, and sometimes when you're at the meeting, I'm listening, but I'm talking and I'm not hearing. And there was a request for the schedule of the revenues adjusted for inflation. And in the minutes, it stated that we would get that to the board. So we went ahead and calculated it, and I've included it on your table today, which is showing what's happening. And I think, Mr. McCurrick, you were the one that was asking about this. So I don't know if you want to speak to this or not.
Yeah, the main thing was just to understand the value of the dollar that we're spending. And as we think about rolling back rates, or as they're thinking about the rates themselves, this, I believe, should have been in the consideration. I think it has been in the consideration. So I'm fine with it, but I think it's important to understand that we've got you know, the potential of the things that Mr. Milliken has talked about. And with that, that includes, you know, the very high potential of increased inflation, which only reduces the value of the dollar that we're spending, and makes us actually spend more to try to, just to maintain. So I think the new rollback rate would do that, would still allow us to do that. It'll allow us to have enough in the fund balance and the reserves to allow us that if we needed to spend more, we could. And you know, as I emphasized, I think in our discussions, is really my biggest concern is that we don't miss what our major goal is, and that is to support the children of this community and to ensure that they have the most and the highest quality of service that we can provide with the dollars that we have. And I think we're doing that. So I appreciate the review.
Next, we'll go to the Chief Executive Officer's report.
I have very little to add. This is what we've been working on. I would just sort of underline, I think you've heard some of these pieces before, but I really want to credit our program financial analyst group. Stacy Gill leads that over there. They have been working to assure that while agencies are accountable and the dollars are spent in the ways we expect to implement the programs, that we find ways to be flexible with budget amendments when they make sense. You know, what we don't want to do is say, this is the budget for a program, it has these kinds of staff involved in order to do X, Y, Z. And yes, there are some participant expenses for snacks or for this or for that or for school supplies. And we have budgets for those sorts of things. But if we've had to downsize the program because of staff, we don't all of a sudden, and I'm being a little bit flip, but we don't want to be funding pizza parties in August and September because there's extra money in the budget. And you know, there has been that inclination when an agency was sort of punished for lapse, that they would be very creative in trying to find ways to spend the money in August and September. And we want to make sure that I mean, every dollar is a taxpayer dollar, and we want to make sure that those dollars are responsibly spent and responsibly spent in the way that we all agreed the program needed to be. Yes, it needs, for instance, some money for things like field trips or some money for things like snacks and some money for other supplies for kids. But I think we would know it when we saw it, in the words of a Supreme Court justice, but there are points at which we would cringe because we don't think those monies are well spent. So I just want to give credit. I've been educated a little bit on I knew some, but more of our past. There was a time we limited the number of budget amendments that an agency could make. We don't do that anymore, which means Stacy and her staff, I mean, that means more work. It means more work for program monitoring folks and so on. But it has been responsive to, I think, to Mr. McCurrick's point, doing the right thing for kids. It's really not a matter of whether we, quote, punish an agency or not. The real point is we all want to serve kids. So I just wanted to share some of that with you.
Can I just add, as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, in line with what Beth is saying, many of the agencies are starting to look at how much budget they haven't spent in lapse. And I was informed yesterday from Stacy that she right now has 15 budget amendment requests, and we're only in June. So I can anticipate those coming in the next month or so as they scramble and look at their remaining budget to see if they can appropriately spend it. But I totally am in agreement with Beth that these budget amendments, if they are related to the program, to enhance the program, and we look at that and we improve it, but if it's just to celebrate because I have extra money, then that's not going to get approved.
That's how we end up in the newspaper.
Exactly.
We're going to
And you know,
Astroscape,
Brian,
right?
it's just wrong,
Right,
you know?
right.
But both things.
But that, staying on that line, I mentioned this to Beth earlier, I happened to have, I was on my licensing bureau meeting yesterday where we reviewed the budgets going forward. And so as we started to review the budgets, there was a rollover and a discussion. So it gave me the opportunity to ask the question, did you have a conversation with JWB? Did you have any other, was there some flexibility? Were there some discussions? It really sat around a need for an additional employee, which they haven't been able to get yet, but they're working very diligently on. Very satisfying to hear, and I hope Commissioner Gerard took that the same way, that it was a very positive message, a very positive discussion with the team. There was a discussion. There was a look at the actual budget in itself, and there was a compromise made to ensure that they could continue moving forward while they're trying to add this additional person. But it wasn't, there were no issues brought up around it. But clearly they understood the impacts one way or the other, and the staff worked extremely well with them to come up with a solution. So I was happy to hear that, because that was a question that came up at the board meeting, and it was proven that the staff did what they were supposed to. So thank you.
The other thing I would report to the board, quite apart from all of this, is you may have heard, we heard that that due to a Florida statute that was passed not this last session but the previous session, I believe it was either called TEACH or REACH. I'm not sure which the acronym was, but the purpose of it was for Florida state dollars in the workforce development space to be used for programs that resulted in the individuals who went through them, whether they're certificate programs or AS degrees, for instance, that they would actually come out with a skill that the market would value at, I want to say, at that point in time, it was $52,000 a year, that would be a salary. They could both get those positions, and that would be the salary for those positions. That people had really been lifted up economically, which is a great concept. One of the fallouts of that, I'm hoping an unintended consequence, but the early childhood education associate's degree at SPC would have been a program that does not meet that standard, because with an associate's degree in early childhood education, the market doesn't pay you $52,000 a year. So it was essentially on the chopping block, not directly by the state, but as a consequence of that statute. And when we heard that, we had great concern, because of course we're trying to invest in quality early learning across the board. We want teachers in those the quality early learning environments to actually have a bachelor's degree, but we want more assistants who are at the associate's degree. Anyway, I called up SPC. We had a meeting just to express our concern and say, is there any other way to skin this cat? And sometimes there are. And actually, SPC, in working through that, has figured out a way to assure that folks can get an associate's degree and have a significant number of their courses be in early childhood, a bigger amount, if you will, in general ed. So it is an AA degree as opposed to an AS degree. In that world, that makes all the difference. The AS degrees have to fall into this workforce, the workforce requirement, because an AS is considered to be a terminal degree. An AA, however, is on the path towards a bachelor's degree and doesn't have that same requirement. Requirement just means whether there would be state money available to SPC in order to do the program. And give or take, 2/3 of their dollars in any given program come from the state. So with only scholarship dollars like we provide, or tuition dollars that the participants provide, that just doesn't give SPC the money to do it. So that's how it came to be on the chopping block in the first place. So I wanted to lift up SPC for their hard work at figuring out a way to keep early childhood education opportunities alive in our community. And I think, sometimes when we make that call and lift something up, that helps too. And that is a role in quiet ways and bigger ways that the Juvenile Welfare Board has always played.
We're now at the open agenda. Do we have anything for the open agenda? No cards? Okay. Motion to adjourn? Thank you.